Exactly.
tree next to the driveway. I don't think I'm going to forget.
Princess died. Oh, good. It's on my list. Okay, all right.
I'm doing all right so far. Doing okay. I'm so that's what it's going to. Yeah. Hold on.
All right, I've got a brand new battery, so we should be really good. We are just finishing up with question 5. It's question 5. Let's see here. Wow. Yes. I have so many notes on question 5, I don't even know where we are. I'll have to redo that. Anyway, we're talking about the things that were universally known about God, and then we'll discuss those in detail here. So thank you all for being here. Let's begin with the prayer. Our Father in heaven, thank you so much for the good morning, the safe arrival of each one, and for another opportunity for us to gather together to enjoy one another's company, to encourage one another, to edify one another, and to savor the fellowship that we share in Jesus Christ. We're thankful for this time to open your word and for this epistle. We pray, Father, for understanding and guidance, both in knowing what it says and in applying it to our lives. Be with those that are unable to be with us, either because of health or traveling. And we look forward to the time when we'll all be together with you in heaven. Is our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. So the last thing that we really discussed was what was universally known about God, which was actually the question. And Paul said that from the creation of the world, which would be from Genesis chapter 1 to the present time, God's invisible qualities are known. And we just finished up talking last week about the oxymoron of that statement, that the invisible qualities are clearly seen. And Paul is really just emphasizing the reality of their knowledge, and that these things can be seen in the presence of other things. And so what are those characteristics or qualities? That's where we left off last week.
Eternal power.
Okay, so his eternal power and,
Divine.
yes, or as mine says, his divine nature. So obviously the word for eternal is almost like adios, only it has A-I-D-I-O-S. It's kind of a rare word in the New Testament. You would think that eternal would be just about everywhere, but it's here and it's in Jude verse 6. That's the only place in the New Testament that it's found. And obviously there's no question that God is eternal. The question is, how can God's eternal nature or everlastingness be seen in the presence or by means of the created things? And I think Paul is assuming a basic form of what we call the cosmological argument, and for God's existence, that everything that exists has a contingent element on it. It's dependent, it's reliant, it's conditional. Everything that we come in contact with has a beginning, and it's perishable. The first and second law of thermodynamics enters into that. And so they have to have come from a creator, a cause before this effect that you and I see. And God is not contingent. And he's eternal and he's imperishable. And so the power, and it's not talking about his omnipotence in that, it's just that it's always been there. His power has always been there. And then the second thing that Tammy mentioned is his divine nature. Some of you have his Godhead. It's just basically the fact that he is deity, the sum total of the characteristics and perfections of being God are seen in the created things. And so all of it is there. And let me just pass out some really quick passages here. Acts 17:25, Psalm 19:1, Acts 14:17, and Romans 1:32. So here's some of God's glorious attributes, or the characters that show that he is God. What's Acts 17:25 say? Who has it? Okay, Nathan?
And he is not served by human hands as if he did anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else.
Okay, so he's the source of life, which it's like the death nail, the last nail in the coffin for evolutionists. Where does life come from? It can't come from matter, it can't come from dead matter, because from nothing you get nothing. And so this is one of the examples of his deity, his Godheadness, his divine nature, is that he's the one who gives all life. Who has Psalm 19:1? Okay, John?
The heavens are telling of the glory of God, and their expanse is declaring the work of his hands.
Okay, so another attribute or characteristic of God is his glory. And in fact, can you and I, in our present bodies, could we view his glory and live? I mean, we've had that. No, we could not. Acts 14:17. Okay, Josh?
And yet he did not leave himself without witness, and that he did good and gave you from heaven rains fruitful seasons, filling your hearts with food and gladness.
Okay, so just his basic goodness. In fact, you remember that when the rich young nobleman came up to Jesus and said, good master, and what did Jesus say? No one's good but God. And here is the statement, he's good. That's part of his nature. And then Romans 1:32, which we're going to be at before too long, but what do we have there? Who has that? Okay, Cindy?
Who, knowing the judgment of God, that they which commit such things are worthy of death, not only do the same, but have pleasure in them that do them.
Okay, so his righteous judgment is also a characteristic. And listen, we could just go on. We could talk about his wisdom, we could talk about his beauty, diversity, his unity, his majesty, his authority. All of these are attributes and characteristics of God. And all of these are present, in the present tense. All of these are clearly seen. And the word for seen here is horao, H-O-R-A-O. And it's a word of seeing, it's a normal word for seeing something with the eye. You probably make a note of that, Mike, and write that down. John 1:18 is an example of that. This is, no one has seen God, but God, the one and only, who is at the Father's side, has made him. No one has, with their eye, seen God. And so that's the normal word there. And you add the prefix to this, or prefix to that, which is kata, which means clear or manifest. In other words, what you see about God through the creation is clearly seen. It's not hazy, it's not indistinct, it's not, I can't quite make that out. And so he's saying here that it can not only be seen, but it can be understood by what we see. And it's understood by what has been made. And again, understand is the Greek word noeo, N-O-E-O. And it means to apprehend. It's mentally seeing. It's an activity of the mind that you can picture it in your mind. And so again, that talks about the fact that the knowledge is real. And it's made by the things made by God in the activity of creation, which all of us can see. It's visible for us. Now, you can't just turn to Romans 1:18 and say, okay, this proves the existence of God, because it doesn't tell us everything about God. Yes, his nature, his divinity, his power is seen, but it's limited into in the truths about God. How many gods are there? Well, you can't tell that from this text. Okay. What is the extent of his power? Infinite. You can't tell from this text. You don't know that God, from this text, when God was done, he said, I am spent. I couldn't create another thing. That he used every bit of his power to create what we see. We don't know that. We're told in other places, told in Psalm, that the creation is what? Handiwork. It just, when we were at the fair, I don't know, maybe it's a condition of working for the county auditor's office, but almost every woman that worked over there was crocheting. I mean, the whole time. And I pointed out to somebody, I said, that's handiwork. Just doing this, not even paying much attention to it. And that's what God did when he created the universe. It's just this. And obviously there's nothing about salvation in this text. So even the creation, as we look at it, is tainted because of the sin that's in the world. And so we see the cracks and the faults that God allowed to come in when sin entered. We have death and we have disease, and none of those things are the result of the glory of God, but because of the fact that sin entered the world. But still, the result of what we can see, we can know these things about God, and we are without what? Without excuse. Again, the target of this whole statement is against the Gentiles who say, we don't need grace because we didn't know. We didn't get the law. How can we be blamed? How can we be responsible for that? This information, this knowledge about God, this knowledge of God that we're without excuse, again, doesn't just apply to the Gentiles, it also obviously applies to the Jews. The word for excuse has at the end of it apologetos, and it's an apologetos, and it's only used here and in chapter 2 and verse 1, where it says, now therefore, have no excuse, you who pass judgment on someone else. And so it's used here at the beginning with regard to the Gentiles, and used again with the Jews, which means there's no defense. There's nothing that you can say as an excuse for why you don't believe, let alone what they're about to do, which is we don't even want to have God in our knowledge. And consequently, no one can plead ignorance. And listen, to be without excuse speaks volumes of free will and responsibility. You get to choose, but you're responsible for the choice that you make. And adequate knowledge of the standard by which everyone's going to be judged is right there for you to see. So the godless, wicked behavior of the Gentiles that we're about to enter into here, Paul is saying is inexcusable in view of all that they knew about God, about his divine nature and his power and his character. And so God is going to be justified in pouring out wrath on them. And of course, this next section of Romans 1 makes that clear. So Paul closes out this first section here with proving or providing that there was universal knowledge of God and of his law. Not the law of Moses, but his moral law and all that went with it, the natural law. Any comments on that? Yes?
The concept of eternity, we're told in Ecclesiastes 3:11 that God placed eternity in our hearts. So this knowledge that things exist beyond us and is also placed within us, so that we start looking for something that is eternal.
Right, and again, that gets back to the fact that everything that we come in contact with has a beginning. Who started it? And that's the eternity that's been placed in our hearts. We know that there's something back there that's greater than what we can see. Yes, Randy?
We're going to get to it eventually, but in chapter 11, in verse 22, Paul says to consider both the goodness and severity of God. And you can see that in nature. It's extremely beautiful, but, Bambi gets attacked by a mountain lion, and it's pretty severe. So, anyway, you can see that in nature, and even in civil law, there's consequence for people's actions. Right. Yeah, Robin has a reel or somebody that she sees every once in a while, and it showed a falcon taking a baby osprey out of a nest, and you want to cry for the little baby osprey, but it's nature. So. All right, question 6. How does Paul describe the reaction of the Gentiles to this revelation about God in verses 21 through 25? And let's go ahead and read that. And I'll just give you a heads up here, too. When we get down into the latter section where there's all of these various sins and horrible things that the Gentiles went into, I am not going to be taking the time to define each one of those. We've gone through those before. You all have at your fingertips the ability to find that out. I don't want to take the time in class to redo that. But let's go ahead and read verses 21 through 25. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal man and birds and animals and reptiles. Therefore God gave them over in their sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity for the degrading of their bodies with one another,
They exchanged the truth of God for a lie and worshiped and served created things rather than the Creator who is forever praised. Amen. And so what does Paul say that the Gentiles did here? How did they react to this revelation about God? Otto?
I just put a cover-all statement. They lost all reason, all sense of reason
Okay.
in order to justify not worshiping God.
Okay. Anybody else? Tammy?
Well, it started with not honoring God as God and giving thanks for the things they can see and
Okay.
receiving.
Okay. So they didn't honor him, and Tammy said, and they didn't give thanks. And he opens a second phase of this argument, which is basically the universal rejection of God by the Gentiles. And again, this is given to the assumption that the Gentiles are an exception with regards to their need for grace. They're saying they don't need that. And he already showed them that they do have a true knowledge of God, and now he's going to show them that they rejected that truth and they rejected God. And he begins with the statement, for although they knew God. And we can almost fill in the rest of that sentence. Even though they knew God, they didn't respond correctly or appropriately. And it's not that this knowledge about God would have necessarily been saving knowledge, as in the sense of John 17:3 and Jesus' prayer, that the knowledge of God is salvation. Turn over there and read that. Now this is eternal life, that they may know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ whom you have sent. Even in John, Jesus accepted, not only just must you know God, but you also must know Jesus Christ. That's the last part of that, to bring salvation. But it should have evoked the response that Paul mentions to the Athenians in Acts the 17th chapter and at verse 27. God did this so that men would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. But this knowledge of God, instead of causing them to, as Paul said there, seek and perhaps reach out for God and find him, what did they do?
Did not want to retain God.
Yeah, they pushed him away. They wanted nothing to do with him. So exactly the opposite of what God's intention was in giving them all of that information that they might come to him, they did exactly the opposite. And listen, if you're going to go away from the true God, what Paul is saying here kind of goes back to what Tammy said a minute ago. There's this he put eternity in our hearts. So we know that there's something greater than us. If you're going to turn away from the true God, what are you going to turn to? A false God. So that leads ultimately to idolatry. And idolatry inexorably leads to immorality. I mean, they're just tied together. I'll probably say that again a little bit later. So, despite their knowledge of God, they had two opposite responses. First one, they didn't glorify him. They didn't glorify God. And again, back to Acts 17, knowledge of God should naturally result in glorifying him. And this is man's highest good. This is man's highest obligation. Let me give you some more passages here real quick. Exodus 20 and verse 3, Matthew 22:37, Matthew 6:33. So who has Exodus 20 and verse 3? Okay, Mike?
You shall have no other gods before me.
Okay? I mean, that's the expectation that God has for us. Matthew 22:37. Okay, Randy?
Jesus said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind.
Okay, so again, this is our obligation. This is the greatest thing that we can give ourselves to. And then Matthew 6:33, you probably can quote this one, John.
But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you.
Okay, so and seeking God's kingdom basically means you're seeking his reign, his rule in your life. And so if glorifying God is man's prime directive, if it's his overriding obligation, then how would you describe failure to glorify God?
Abject failure. It's the
It would have to be almost the worst sin possible. If this is your highest obligation and you're rejecting that, then that's the worst thing that you could possibly do. And especially when it's done with a clear knowledge of God. I mean, even though they knew God, I'm not going to glorify you. I'm going to turn away from you. And then the second response again was what? They didn't glorify God, and they didn't what?
Give thanks.
They didn't give thanks. So knowledge of God should also result in gratitude, in thanksgiving toward God. If creation and everything that's around us is a result of God's creation, it's a product of God, then every blessing that we have comes from him. And again, these passages you're familiar with these. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 45. That you may be sons of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. Acts chapter 14 and verse 17. Paul there said that yet he has not left himself without testimony or witness, which is exactly what we're talking about here. He has shown kindness by giving you rain from heaven and crops in their seasons. He provides you with plenty of food and fills your hearts with joy. So giving thanks is simply acknowledging that what we have comes from God. And it's not what you have isn't the result of blind fortune. It's not the result of your own human merit, but comes from God. And in giving him thanks, we confess our dependence on him. And listen, that's even seen in just the simple act of just before you eat a meal, that you thank God for the food that's in front of you. So the Gentiles didn't even do that. They didn't do that simple thing. Pardon me? And still don't. And many times don't, yeah. I remember I had the great fortune when I was going into the 7th grade. I got to spend some time with an aunt and uncle down in Alabama, probably 4 or 5 days, and they had a farm, and they gave me some chores, one of which was to slop the hogs. So I went down to the barn, I grabbed the dry corn, and I put it through the sheller and got all the corn out, and then I added water and a bunch of junk. And what do you call that stuff that you feed hogs? Slop. And I got to call the hogs in, I got, "See!" like that, and man, they came running. And I'm trying to pour this in the trough, and where are they? All over and in the trough. I can't get it in there without dropping it on their heads. But where were their heads? Down, looking down. There wasn't a pig there that thanked me. Even though I'm the one holding the bucket. Okay? And that's what this is talking about. The Gentiles just had their heads down. They never looked up. They never thought about where these things came from. And so both of these obligations mirror God's purpose for creating the universe and mankind to glorify himself and to share his goodness with mankind. And they didn't respond to either one. So, in setting their minds against God, they removed that key element that makes sense out of everything. Their thinking became futile, is what my translation says. And the Greek word here is dialogismos. So it has dialogue in it without the UE on the end, and then ismos, I-S-M-O-S. And it means evil, devious, useless, empty, worthless, pointless. So everything, instead of being true, now becomes speculation and self-serving rationalization. Their foolish heart was darkened. And of course, the heart here is the seat of your emotion and your will and your thinking. And when it becomes foolish, its thinking is futile. I read one commentary, and I have grandkids that can't say this word, But they said it was just plain, they just became plain stupid. That's basically what the Gentiles did. And it was darkened because according to 1 John 1:5, God is light. And if you turn away from light, what's left? Just darkness. Any exclusion of God is going to result in that. Paul parallels that in Ephesians, the 4th chapter, when he talks about who we're fighting against in verses 17 and 18. I tell you and insist on this in the Lord, that you must no longer live as the Gentiles do in the futility of their thinking. They are darkened in their understanding and separated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them due to the hardening of their hearts. They don't want to know God. They don't want to even let him in. And so here's the juxtaposition, the irony of this is claiming to be wise. What happened? They became fools. Listen, wisdom is making right choices and decisions based on available knowledge. So you have knowledge, you use that knowledge correctly, and then that makes you able to make decisions, makes you able to make choices that are proper. And how would most people who've rejected God, how would they describe themselves?
Enlightened.
Yeah, enlightened, wise. They're the wise ones because they have rejected God. And they would even say that is evidence for their wisdom is their rejection of God. And the truth of the matter is that they become fools because they have rejected the basic truth that we just spent some time looking at, upon which true wisdom and right choices and decisions can be made. So they had no alternative but to become fools. Anybody know what the root word of fool is? You probably will never forget it after today. We get our word moron from this Greek word. Moreno, M-O-R-A-I-N-O. You all know what a sophomore is, right?
Sophisticated.
Pardon me?
A sophisticated moron.
Yeah, well, a wise fool.
Yeah.
How many of you have known sophomores? I've known a lot of sophomores. They know everything. Because they had Psych 101 and they had the basics, and so they are wise, but they're still fools. But they think they know it all. And that's most sophomores don't realize that, they think, well, it's my second year in high school. No, it means you're a wise fool. And so they become silly, they become moronic. They made fools of themselves by their rejection of God. And that's going to be especially true in the moral range, in the moral part of life. And so Paul gives us a prime example of foolishness. They exchanged the glory of the immortal God for what?
Images of the corruptible.
Okay, so images of man, images of birds. Paul covers almost every kind of animal here. Birds, animals, and reptiles. So they made a trade. They traded the glory of the immortal God, and they exchanged that for the image of mortal man, birds, animals, and reptiles. Now listen, just on a very basic level, if you measure somebody's wisdom based on the trades that they make, on the swaps, the deals that they make, this is the worst possible exchange you could have made. You're trading God in all of his glory and power and knowledge and all that goes with him for an idol, for something that's corruptible. And again, we've seen in Psalm 19:1, the glory and immortality of God is clearly seen in the creation, in the glory. In fact, it shouts it to every tongue and every nation. And so there's nothing more valuable, nothing more precious than that. And if you have that knowledge, then you shouldn't surrender it for any price. Yet they exchanged it for the grossest forms of idolatry. What are some human forms of idolatry? They exchanged it for humans. Can you think of any?
Seattle Seahawks.
Pardon me?
Seattle Seahawks.
The Seattle Seahawks. To a certain extent, that's true. I mean, I remember when we first moved here, and we had a meeting of our now long dead neighborhood association, and some of them were saying that the football game at church, that was their church. So that was right. Tim? Wealth? Well, I'm talking about a human being, taking a human form. Okay, most of the Greek gods had human form, but even you had fleshly. The Caesars were set up as gods. The pharaohs were set up as gods. Well, he puts himself, it says, maybe in the place of God. That's a possibility. Yes?
And along with the Seahawks, the type of thing we put celebrities and politicians on pedestals.
Right. And I realize that we do this still today. I'm just looking at what Paul was talking about and what they would have understood then. How about the birds? You have Horus, who was a falcon, and Thoth, ibis, all of which were Egyptian. Animals are easy for you. Pardon me? Calf, bulls, the Baals, and jackals and rams and all kinds of things like that. How about reptiles? Yeah, what snake specifically do you remember that became an idol?
The snake on the staff.
Yeah, the brazen serpent that Moses made actually became an idol for them. Was it when we were in Austria that we saw a mummified crocodile? So there was a crocodile that was actually then worshipped and mummified in Egypt. And what's the characteristic of man, birds, animals, and reptiles? What's the one thing they all share? They all die. They all die. They are all mortal. And listen, Paul could have stopped right there. You've changed the immortal God for something that is mortal. Because they all die. Yes?
So would that mean that the Native Americans and all of the symbols that they have and things that they show in their representation that they honor, is that they're being godless in their beliefs?
Yes, I think so. Yeah, they got their totems that they worship, and it has all kinds of creatures on it. Listen, that's just, if you're going to reject, and listen, if I am correct, the Indians also had a great spirit that was supposedly above all the rest. But yeah, anytime that you exchange the glory of God for something else, attribute what's due him to something else that's created, then that's idolatry. John?
The snake on the post or on the stick, cross, whatever you want to put it on, managed to survive until today. It's still the symbol of certain aspects of the medical.
Yeah. Septis or Sepis, I can't remember. But yes. Yeah, thank you. And again, they rejected him, and God again is justified in his wrath because they knew God. But he goes on and says that God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts. So you need to understand the therefore there, or my translation has because of this. I guess back in 24 it is therefore. Giving them over in the desires of their heart here is a part of the wrath of God. It's part of the wrath of God to let them go their own way. And how did he do this? Well, I think mainly he did it because he ceased his providential restraint in holding them back from going as far as they wanted to go. There was no more hindrance placed in their path in regards to their sin. He didn't try to stop them. If we go over to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verses 6 and 7, Paul says, "And now you know what is holding him back, so that he may be revealed at the proper time. For the secret power of the law of lawlessness is already at work, but the one who now holds it back will continue to do so till he is taken out of the way." So even there, and I may not even understand what that's talking about, but there was some restraint that God was putting out. There was some restraint that he was applying, and what we're seeing in Romans is God removed that. I mean, there was he just opened it up to them. And so there is a restraint imposed by God if they're ignorant, but if they're in full rebellion, as they are here, where they say, we don't even have God in our knowledge, we're not going to glorify him, it's going to be removed. Let's again look at a couple of passages. Somebody can turn here for me. Psalm 78:29, and also in the book of Psalm 106:14 and 15. Psalm 78:29 and Psalm 106:14 and 15. Who has 78:29? Tammy?
So they ate and were filled, and their desire he gave to them.
Okay, so he just let them go. They ate and he let them go to their desire. Psalm 106:14 and 15. Okay, Mike?
But lusted exceedingly in the wilderness and tempted God in the desert, and he gave them their request, but sent leanness unto their soul.
Okay, so again, God's just going to, okay, this is what you want. This is what you're going to get. So God withholding or giving them over is not an act of an indifferent God. He's not just saying, okay, you can have what you want. It's a deliberate, purposeful act of God to give them over. And I don't know what your translations have. He didn't give them over to the sinful desires of their heart. Does any of you have that word "to" there? In the first part of verse 24, therefore God gave them over or actually the word is in, or of is perfectly okay as well. What's it saying is the desire was already there. The desire was already in their heart, or it was a characteristic of their heart. And so he gave them over to that. The desires were already there that he gave them over to. And so because of their idolatry, because of their lust-filled hearts, the desire was already, that's part of the reason they don't want to have God. They want to do what they want to do. They don't want God telling them what to do. And so the punitive action of God was to not restrain them any further. He gave them over to sexual impurity. And listen, that's not a condemnation of sex as such. It's rather sexual activity that's out of control, without any restraints of God's law. And Paul's going to say in 1 Corinthians 6 chapter and verse 18, when you do that, you sin against yourself. Degrading is akatharsia, akatharsia. It means to dishonor, to debase, to disgrace. And so the thought came to me, and maybe you're wondering too, how can allowing one to fulfill their desires be punitive? The first thought that I had when I thought of that was kids caught smoking. And so what does the dad do? Go ahead, just keep going at it until they get sick. So okay, I'll let you do what you want to do. It's like the child that wants to stay up all night. All right? And not letting them sleep. You're going to stay awake because that's what you wanted. Did you have a comment, Nathan?
Yeah, he expands on kind of this topic in chapter 2. So in chapter 2:14, he says, "For when the Gentiles who do not have the law, by nature, do what the law requires, they are a law unto themselves."
Right.
So it's unnatural to go against the law.
Right.
The natural order of things is to do what God wants us to
Right.
do. So he's allowing them to go against nature.
Right. Because that was what their desire was in their heart. They don't have anything to do with that. You weren't here last week when we talked about that, and you won't be here when we actually get to 2:14, so I'm glad you brought that up. So he gave them over not just in the sinful desires of their hearts, and this is the point that we need to understand, but also to the consequences of those sins. Okay? Now, and this is where the punishment comes in. Look what's going to happen when you do what you want. Especially with regards to what he talks about here as he introduces this, the sexual impurity. There's physical consequences to that. Aside from venereal disease and AIDS and cancer and liver, problems with your liver because you're drinking too much, because you're doing this or that too much. Let's just go ahead and we'll stop there and start back over and wonder how allowing one to fulfill their desires is punitive. That's where we'll start next week, which will be 9:10. All right, and we will for sure be getting into lesson 4, and those sheets are back there on the table. And if you get the emails, you already got it yesterday.
It's not the same.
Go away.